G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. Today we are looking at the race week preview for the Australian Grand Prix and my final thoughts ahead of qualifying and the deadline right around the corner. If you enjoy the content, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Really appreciative of all of the love and support from you guys so far. So this is going to be very much a brief snapshot of my stream of consciousness ahead of the deadline. This evening for me in the US, in the morning for viewers in the UK and Europe. Budget drivers probably been the hottest topic of conversation, given the template for triple Red Bull, triple Aston Martin is fairly locked in. I don't think I'm going to pivot away from that at the moment, just because even Stroll, who was the only primary concern for me outside of that budget driver slot, just seems to look too good, and compared to other people in that price bracket. I know Gasly looks solid in practice, should I say, but for me, the pace over the course of the whole race for that Aston Martin really makes it hard for me to part ways with Lance Stroll. So I think that's pretty locked in, which, as I said, leads me into that budget driver slot. I've touched on throughout the week and leading up to the Australian Grand Prix that De Vries and Logan Sargeant are the two guys I will be considering for that final position. Sargeant, I had him last week. He had 2 points, not a score that I was hoping for, but I guess you can't really get too upset about a budget driver because of how unpredictable the outcome for them can be. So De Vries, he, much like Sargeant, didn't really do anything too spectacular in FP1 and FP2. The interesting thing was, however, that Logan Sargeant did experience some engine problems in FP1. He didn't participate in FP2 as a result of that. And given what we saw last week with Alex Albon in Saudi Arabia, there is obvious concerns that the reliability for that Williams is prevalent. So obviously something just to think about and mull over. We haven't really heard anything since, or at least I haven't heard anything since then to suggest that what they're dealing with has been fully rectified, and whether or not that will result in grid penalties or whatever it is. But just stay tuned for the news leading up to the deadline. So it really comes down to Sargeant or De Vries. The AlphaTauris, as I said, are another team that don't qualify particularly well. So that means there's a higher upside for overtakes and positions gained in the race. If I choose not to go for De Vries, it'll probably be Yuki Tsunoda, but Tsunoda, as I've previously pointed out, can qualify slightly better than De Vries. So I am leaning towards the Dutchman for that reason, and I will probably make my decision closer to the deadline on who I want to go with, but those are the two guys shortlisted to take Sargeant's seat in my team if I choose not to proceed with him for a second consecutive week. So the next thing I've got here is my chip usage. I've made it abundantly clear on Twitter, if you follow my preview threads and other tweets, that Australia is another street circuit with a very high DNF rate. Only 3 DNFs apiece in the last 2 races there, 2022 and 2019. But if you look a bit further back than that, anywhere between 4, 7, 8, 9 DNSs, disqualifications in a race at Albert Park. So it's, with every street circuit, warrants consideration for using that no negative. I personally don't feel strongly enough to use it this week. So unless we see sudden rain and weather changes come through on the Sunday, or are expected to come through on the Sunday, which makes me pivot into using that, I probably won't, and will save it for another race further down the line. But that is probably the only chip I would recommend. There's no real justification that can be made for the extra DRS boost, the Limitless. We've seen a lot of people higher up the leaderboards activate those already, but I expect over the course of an entire season, those who use it at races that are probably less favorable will regress, and those people who use those chips at those more optimal times will move up the ranks. So don't be too trigger happy if you're looking to use it at the best time, because there'll be plenty more opportunities ahead for you to do so. And the last thing I wanted to cover were just a few questions submitted by followers on Twitter. If you do, obviously in future races, have any questions, be sure to shoot them to me on any of my Twitter posts. I usually send one out before the race, so be sure to comment below if you want yours featured. So 3 I've got here. The first one from @Calva, is Bottas worth keeping? Who is a great replacement for him? I think Bottas looked really solid in that first race in Bahrain, but tailed off a bit in Saudi Arabia. I was a little surprised, actually. I thought the Alfa Romeo really had that pace to set them apart from the rest of the midfield, but I didn't really see a performance encouraging of holding on to him after that race. Not that I had him in the first place, but I was a little just discouraged in general by the signs and the drive from the Finn. So for me, the obvious replacement at the same price bracket is Lance Stroll. For obvious reasons, he's in that Aston Martin. It's looking like a rocket ship. Should be contending for podiums, if not in the points, just about every week. The only, I guess, argument you can make against having him is the triple up on Aston Martin. For me personally, I think it's a risk worth taking. But if you are more risk averse and want to play that safer game, obviously that happened last week with Stroll where he DNF'd, and if you owned Aston Martin too, that was a 40-point hit to your total. Then Gasly's another option. I've touched on him previously in my watch list videos. I would highly recommend checking that out if you want more information on why Gasly is warranting consideration in your fantasy team. So those are the two that I would suggest in the first instance. If you want to go a little bit more differential, that kind of leads me into the next question we've got from Yank the Mike. Big fan of Mike, very engaging on Twitter and YouTube, so I appreciate the love there, Mike. Dare we pick Piastri? Will the pressure of his home race help or hinder his performance? I saw, I guess, a few encouraging signs in Saudi Arabia to suggest Piastri could become a viable option down the line. That first race at Bahrain, didn't really get off to the greatest start for his F1 career, but I saw in qualifying in Saudi Arabia, he made it through to Q3. So obviously a great performance from him. It was just a shame his race was ruined on that first lap where he was clipped. So, and that pretty much put an end to any chance he had of getting points. So I think Piastri's out to really feature in the points this race. He's probably the driver I'm most high on, and as an Australian myself, really hope he can do well at Albert Park. I think we've seen Ricciardo in the past struggle there, given the pressure of racing at your home circuit. But I think Piastri, he's very much a high upside play, even though that McLaren does look a little slow for my liking. He seems to have extracted as much performance out of the car as possible when his race isn't affected by others around him or the reliability of that McLaren. So I would personally steer clear of him given just how strong the template is at the moment. I can hardly justify swapping him in for someone like Lance Stroll. However, I still do like him as an option, and I think if you're running more than one fantasy team, a lot of us have 2 or 3 teams, then he's an excellent alternative to someone like Stroll or even Bottas if you do want to mix things up a little bit. So I think Piastri will definitely deliver a solid performance in Melbourne, but whether or not he's able to outperform Stroll from a fantasy perspective is something different altogether. I'm just not quite sure he's got that in him yet. We might see something differently down the line, and I do hope so. But as I said, probably a very high upside play if you're chasing ranks or whatever it might be. But Stroll for me is probably the better option if we're tossing up between him and Piastri. The last question I have is from Carbo Choi. I hope I pronounced that right. If I'm chasing points in my mini leagues and want to take a punt, who should I get? That's a great question. I think we've seen a lot of teams activate various chips in the first 2 races of the season. They've flown ahead because you've had people like Verstappen or Alonso on those extra DRS boosts. So understandably, those teams are going to be much further afield. But even if you are behind, say, 50, 100, 150 points in your mini league, this is a very long season. We're only at the 3rd race. We've got another 20 or so to go after Australia. So I wouldn't be at panic stations right away. I can appreciate that if you've got a bit of a gap to make up, there are obvious alarm bells that might be ringing. But I think as I've said, people who have already used those chips early in the season, some of these races are probably not the most optimal. Yes, I think if you extra DRS boosted Verstappen last week, you got very lucky. You got driver of the day and the fastest lap. But there are going to be sprint races you're able to capitalize on that. There's also the autopilot chip, which automatically defers to your highest scoring driver to use at sprint races, the Limitless, you name it. there are going to be plenty of opportunities to make up that ground. I don't think there's a need to suddenly go fully differential by choosing budget constructors outside of Aston Martin for the sake of being different. I think, if you can stick to, triple Red Bull, if you want to mix it up, sure, go someone instead of Troll like Gasly or Piastri. But I don't think there's really a need to suddenly mix up your teams entirely and hope that teams like Red Bull and Aston Martin all DNF in the same race. I think the likelihood of that is very low. So my suggestion is just to kind of bide your time for a few more races. When the ranks shake out a little bit and the positions in fantasy shake out a little bit after about 5, 6, 7 races, then maybe consider going a little bit more differential. But Ferrari is just not doing it for me to go with them. Mercedes are not... They're solid, but they're not spectacular for me. And then every other constructor outside of Aston Martin is an absolute no-go. So I would stick to the template as much as possible. And if you do want to go differential, as I said, maybe consider mixing up the budget slot, Stroll. But realistically, I don't think changing out Verstappen, Red Bull, Alonso, and even Aston Martin make a lot of sense in my eyes at this point of the season. So stick to the template as much as possible, and then, as I said, we make it through the season, then there's going to be some opportunity to mix things up. But that's all I wanted to digest right now. Very brief, but wanted to put some final thoughts down. As I said, if you're enjoying the content, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much for watching. Appreciate the love. Good luck this weekend, guys, and I'll see you all very soon.